This discovery led to a gold rush, and many Portuguese people were attracted by the prospect of making a fortune. Ultimately, at the end of the 18th century, Brazil had a population of about 3 million people, including Europeans, indigenous people, slaves brought from Africa, and their descendants.
Economically, a paradoxical situation arose where Brazil, a colony, was wealthier than its home country, Portugal, which was gradually entering a phase of decline after its heyday. In terms of trade relations, Brazil, a colony, was recording a huge surplus with Portugal. Meanwhile, nobles who had been dispatched to Brazil as officials from Portugal were soon able to wield great power in the regions they governed.
When the king first sent officials, he thought they would follow his will, but with successive generations, they gradually exercised independent influence in the region. The large distance between Lisbon and the capital of Portugal and Brazil, and the large distance between the Brazilian coast and its interior made it difficult to develop an efficient centralized administrative system. Therefore, many ruling families emerged in Brazil, each with its own influence, and each managed their region in their own way. Even in Portugal, the home country, leaders were aware of this fact, but there was no practical way to solve it. Therefore, as long as the taxes coming from the colonies were properly paid, there was no alternative other than to pretend not to know about it. The situation became more complicated when the French Revolution began in 1789. Portugal was allied with Britain before the French Revolution began, but Napoleon, who was at odds with Britain, pressured Portugal to corrupt trade with Britain. When Portugal refused, the French army attacked Portugal, and Portugal had no choice but to accept France's demands as terms of peace. Portugal was well aware of the danger that France might attack Portugal again at any time. At that time, Napoleon imposed a continental blockade and pressured Portugal to corrupt economic relations with Britain. Then, in 1807, the difficult decision was made to move the Portuguese royal family from Lisbon, Portugal to Rio de Janeiro. After the French Revolution, Portugal's economic situation worsened as war raged across the European continent. The fact that Brazil prospered even more as IT, a rival country in sugar production, collapsed economically in the aftermath of its War of Independence, also played a role in the royal family's decision to relocate. The arrival of the Portuguese royal family to Brazil had a decisive impact on the Brazilian region. Until the royal family arrived, Brazil's political structure had each loosely connected region exercising its own strong autonomy. However, a more efficient centralized administrative system began to be introduced around Rio de Janeiro, where the royal family now reside.
At the same time, there were nobles who had previously had active influence under the royal family in Portugal and followed the king to Brazil. Conflicts began to arise between the upper class in Brazil, which had already been influential for a long time, and the nobles who had come from Portugal. The main problem that arose between them was a conflict over who would take charge.
Because of this conflict, the upper class who had been living in Brazil for a long time gradually gained strength in the idea of independence from Portugal, but they lacked organizational power. the movement for independence was thwarted by concerns that it might become an attempt to abolish slavery itself, as had been the case in Haiti. In 1815, the Portuguese royal family declared the Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarve.
As a result, Brazil was promoted to a member of the kingdom in name and reality, and Brazil's rising status became an undeniable fact. In Portugal, after the king and royal family had moved to Brazil, there were paradoxical complaints that the country had become a colony of its colonies. Moreover, since the king was not in residence there, Portuguese liberals saw an opportunity and began an uprising in 1820. Then King João VI tried to appease them and promised to introduce a constitution and allow liberals to participate in the government through elections. In these elections of 1821, Brazilians elected their own representatives for the first time. However, when calculating the population, blacks and mixed-race minorities in Brazil were not fairly considered, resulting in a discriminatory policy. Minorities such as blacks in Brazil had no choice but to send fewer representatives proportional to their actual population compared to Portugal. The Portuguese-dominated parliament was unable to prevent discriminatory policies against Brazil's minorities from being introduced. In addition, Portuguese lawmakers urged the king to return to Portugal, and João VI eventually returned to Lisbon in April 21, leaving behind his son Pedro as his representative. Upon the return of João VI, Portuguese lawmakers wanted to go one step further and introduce repressive policies against Brazil. Portuguese lawmakers prepared a bill that would dismantle all bureaucracy introduced in Brazil after the royal family had moved there in 1808, and instead all regions of Brazil would be ruled directly from the Portuguese National Assembly. They continued to ask the king's son, Pedro, to return to Portugal. Pedro had been interacting with Brazil's liberal upper class for a long time, and those who were angry at the demands of the Portuguese legislature demanded that he not return. Pedro had already received a petition signed by 8,000 people saying he should not return to Portugal. Above all, Pedro was hostile to the idea of subordinating the rule of Brazil directly to the Portuguese parliament, and was cheered when he announced that he would not return to Portugal. Even after this, the Portuguese parliament did not change its previous position, and in 1822 announced that it would punish those who did not follow its orders. And they announced Brazil's independence with the well-known statement, "Freedom or Death." Finally, on October 12th of the same year, Pedro was crowned emperor as Pedro I, and on December 1st, Brazil finally became officially independent from Portugal. Independence was achieved relatively peacefully because Portugal no longer had the power to threaten Brazil economically or militarily when it declared independence. Brazil achieved independence from Portugal in 1822, but the form that the country would take as a nation was still uncertain. There were many different factions vying for power, and it was unclear whether the country would be a monarchy or a republic.
The issue of unity was also a major challenge. Brazil is a vast country with a diverse population.
There were many different ethnic groups, cultures, and languages in the country. It was unclear whether these different groups could come together to form a unified nation.
The first Brazilian emperor, Pedro I, was able to maintain unity and was eventually overthrown in 1831. The country then entered a period of political instability, with several different leaders coming to power over the next few decades. It was not until the late 19th century that Brazil finally achieved political stability.
The country became a republic in 1889, and it has been a relatively stable democracy ever since. Brazil is still a diverse country with a number of challenges to overcome. However, the country has made great progress in recent years, and it is now a major economic power and regional leader.
Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world by area and the most populous country in South America. It has a strong economy and is a major player in the global economy. Brazil is also a member of the G20, a group of the world's largest economies. Thank you for watching the video, The Dynamic Creation of Brazil Part 2, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, Cindy, Helena, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.